Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to District 10 Como Community Council's continuation of our 2020 Sunday Series program. I am Jill Henriksen, a District 10 board member and a member of our anti-racism work group. The Sunday Series of 2020 started this spring with a few live events in person that were held at the Como Park Visitor Center. But as we were just getting started, COVID shut us down. So we waited a little bit to see what COVID would do. And then in May, we watched in horror as George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police. And it became clear to us that the disparities and the inequities that exist in our community had been highlighted to a level that was probably unprecedented before with COVID and George Floyd. District 10's response was to create an anti-racism work group. And the work group has two objectives. One, to look internally at our culture and our practices, and two, to look externally and look at potential partnerships with other organizations, such as other district councils and other nonprofits that are advancing race equity work. Bringing back the Sunday series on Zoom with a sole focus on race equity is the work of the anti-racism work group. And before I move on, I want to mention that this Zoom event is being recorded and will be available on our website shortly. So for anyone who's not able to be here today, we will be sure to get the video of this out. And also we will have a discussion and Q&A following Lissa's presentation. And lastly, I want to thank Emily Rodriguez for running the Zoom controls today. And now on to the main event. We are so excited that our first guest speaker to help kick off our Equity Sunday Series event is Lissa Jones-Lofgren, a longtime presenter on the intersection of Black history and equity in today's communities. She is a consultant providing interim executive leadership for nonprofits, including St. Paul District Councils, and she coaches leaders on getting closer to equity in their organizations. In addition, for more than a decade, she has served as creator, executive producer, and host of Urban Agenda on KMOJ, Minnesota's oldest Black-owned and operated radio station. And she's the host of Black Market Reads, a podcast of the Givens Foundation for African American Literature. She's also a member of the Hennepin County's Racial Equity Advisory Council and a member of the City of St. Paul's Racial Equity Advisory Work Group. So we are thrilled to have this amazing woman with us here today. And on that note, I will hand it over to Lissa.
I want to thank you, Jill. Thank you so much for your kindness, and thank you for your grace and for reading that bio. And thank you, Michael, for hosting me. And thank you, Emily, for making sure that we can have dialogue over this computer. I really appreciate it. Emily's going to let me share my screen. First of all, I want to say good afternoon to everybody who's taken time to join us. Thank you for being here. I will advise you, this will be a conversation perhaps unlike most other conversations that you might have, even about this topic, if indeed you do have them. It will be a conversation that we'll have at the end of this presentation. Please do, if you can, make yourself a few notes. There'll be a lot of information coming at you in the next 45 to 60 minutes. And I will ask a few times for you to make a reflection. And since we aren't going to be doing that live together, I'm going to ask you if you would make note for yourself. So if that's something you want to talk about when we have the dialogue at the end of this presentation, we can do that. I hope that that's okay because I can't see everybody, so I'm just going to go with, I hope that's copacetic. Okay, Then let's see, do I need to do anything to
You
share?
should be able to just click the share screen at the bottom. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. Okay. Oh, wonderful. Okay, can you see it now?
I can see it, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you kindly. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, a little feedback.
All right, we'll start here. First of all, the one tie that binds the 17 district councils together is this idea of the road to the community plan. No matter how each district council is organized, because they are all organized similarly and differently, the tie that runs through each of them is this idea that the primary way that the councils are supposed to work is to engage the citizens, the residents and businesses in our district, in the process, the iterative process of planning for investment in housing, transportation, access to water, parks and green spaces, historic preservation, so on and so forth. In his vision, Jim Scheibel, when he decided on putting the district council system into place, really envisioned that the best place for democracy to be affected would be by the people who live in the communities that are most impacted by the decisions that are made by city government. And indeed, that mission, or that endeavor for that mission, still exists today. This graphic actually comes out of the stpaul.gov website, and it communicates to us about the process for community planning for investment. What we know is that neither do the 17 district councils all plan on the same cycle, nor do all the councils plan on the same cycle for investment as the city does, that this process could use improvement. But it is also, or I should say, and it is also the tie that binds us together. In this piece, I'd like you to take just a moment, maybe 2 to 3 minutes, to reflect on this question. And if you can, to make a note. Where do you get your primary information about race? You might think about it in terms of where you first remember talking about race or someone talking to you about it. And perhaps make a note about, if you remember, how you might have felt. And we'll just take a minute or two. Where do you currently get your primary information about race? Okay, thank you. This is Dr. Jane Elliott. You may remember her if you ever watched the Oprah Winfrey Show, doing the black and blue-eyed experiment many, many years ago. She is a leading teacher on race and has been for many, many decades. And she offered this piece some time ago about whether or not people who consider themselves to be white are conscious about what happens to Black people in this country.
If you, as a white person, would be happy to receive the same treatment that our Black citizens do in this society, please stand. You didn't understand the directions. If you white folks want to be treated the way Blacks are in this society, stand. Nobody's standing here. That says very plainly that you know what's happening. You know you don't want it for you. I want to know why you're so willing to accept it or to allow it to happen for others.
One of the reasons I play this piece is because one of the current dialogues I happen to be in often is that many people who are people of color have already been in the conversation about race probably for their entire lives. And there are many people who are not people of color who, after the murder of George Floyd, are just becoming more aware of race and about its impact on our experience. We are, in essence, living two different experiences in the same country. And that is not exclusive to race. If you will, go back to your paper and your pen. And if you will be honest with yourself, if you pay attention to your breath, your body, your reaction, and not your sanitized reaction, like I wish I wouldn't have thought that, but the actual reaction. When I make these statements, what do you remember about what your family or friends might have said as you were coming up about the value of people for whom these statements are true? And what do you pass on as a result of what you remember and what you've been told and what your experience has been? Please remember to pay attention to your breath and be honest. Only you're going to know how you feel, and only you're going to have a copy of your list so that you can use it to reflect in the future on the work you may need to do. I'm white. I'm a lesbian. I speak 3 languages. I suffer from depression. I have 1 leg. I'm an atheist. I'm overweight. I struggle with drug addiction. I'm a Muslim. I'm a single mother. I smoke cigarettes. I don't vote. I lied on my job application. I am poor. I'm Jewish. I'm Black. Now you might just take a little bit of a cleansing breath and put your note aside for reflection at a later time, perhaps even in this call that we'll have a little later. Oftentimes, the way we feel about people is passed to us unconsciously. Culture is transferred, not often by what people say, but the way they sort of bristle when they see a certain person, or they make a certain comment every time they see a certain kind of person doing something that they don't like or agree with. And they don't necessarily say son or daughter don't like these people. They might say, oh, they're always dirty. Oh, you know, they talk so loud. Their food smells funny. I don't understand why they do what they do. They can often be, these beliefs, transferred to us unconsciously. And until such time as we are caused to have to stop and think about them, we don't think about necessarily reflecting on our body's reaction, how we actually feel in our secret hearts, in our non-politically correct on Zoom hearts. Those are the parts that we will want to examine at a later time. Race. Oftentimes when we are talking about areas of difference or similarity, we will talk about race only if we absolutely, positively must do so. Every study for the longest time bears out that we would rather talk about anything than race because we don't yet have a shared language for it. And we don't really understand this construct we've created. And we don't all really share the same agreement about its impact on us and the people to whom it's directed. So race often erases the opportunity for us to see people as cultural human beings. This word map represents just some of the ways that people identify themselves. And I often suggest to people, if you really want to see culture, perhaps close your eyes before you have a conversation with a new person. Perhaps don't do it on Zoom and find out if you have special interests before your eyes race them. Because think about all you would miss if the only thing you got to focus on was that one teeny word, race. And yet, we are so focused on it in this society that it could take over this entire word map and suffocate the entire thing. And ultimately, that is what leads to things like the killing of George Floyd. Resmaa Menakem has written a book titled My Grandmother's Hands. He's writing his second book. It is currently on the New York Times bestseller list. And he's talking about the idea of white body supremacy, the idea that the white male body was presented to the world as the best body you could have, and that that still is the stereotype to which everyone is held to this day. He also recognizes, as a psychologist, that people have to do their own work. White people do not necessarily know that we're not speaking the same language. We might be using the same words in English that have multiple meanings and think that we do know what each other's saying, but we're not speaking the same language. We don't see the world in the same way, and we're not saying the same things. And so for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to offer some definitions. You can choose to use them or not. You can choose to use your own. It's entirely up to you. But for our time together, I like us to have some shared context, and definitions are important because we haven't yet lived in an equitable world. So we haven't developed a language of equity. We have developed a language of race, but not one that helps us solve it, more one that helps us continue it. Race. My friend Tish Jones, the poet, says words mean things. She is the founder of True Art Speaks, and she works with young Black and Brown and Indigenous artists to help them express themselves through poetry and spoken word and written word. And she reminds me that words mean things. Race is a word, a social construct that we made up for the purpose of power, to concentrate the hands of power in, to concentrate the center of power in the hands of one group of people, and to keep a whole bunch of other groups of people from getting that power. That is still the dynamic we find ourselves in. So we created race. It's not an actual biological fact. So our blood is the same color. When things happen inside my body, they look the same way they happen in a white body, but the skin allowed us to separate the group who's up from the group who's down, and allowed us to dehumanize a group of people so as to put them, the product of kidnap, to work for textiles in the north and agriculture in the south for the sole purpose of building the wealth of this country. We constructed race. It comes as a surprise to many people that we used science to support the worldviews that Thomas Jefferson, in his notes from the state of Virginia, introduced for the first time into our national discourse, the idea that Black people were inherently intellectually inferior because we're Black. He gave us a lot of compliments too, which tells you about the crazy making of race, but you'll have to read that for yourself. That's a different class. But it is made up, so it changes over time. You see, if it were a scientific fact, it probably, well, it might change over time, but science, it tends to evolve more slowly by fact and experience. In the case of race, it just changes when people need it to change. So when some groups needed to be considered white for the purpose of counting, like the census, for the purpose of getting resources and concentrating resources in what were deemed white communities, sometimes Italian, Irish, and Jewish people were labeled white. When you look on the census today, you'll find perhaps in the categories for people who, excuse me, might have been called in their past Hispanic, in the present Latinx, Latinx white, Latinx non-white, still this idea that white is the standard. It's required if you're going to race people. And it's required to have science and history and propaganda write that down until everybody believes it. And Harvard can tell you that it changed our DNA. The lie somebody told a long time ago about inferiority and superiority and writing that down is something that kills human beings, all of us, like death by 1,000 cuts, under the auspice that one is winning and everybody else is losing. Privilege. It's a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or only available to a particular person or group. I have what you would call light skin privilege. My father is very dark-skinned and as a result has a very different experience. He's also a man. I identify as a woman. So we have similar experiences as Black people and different experiences as Black people. Because I'm closer to white, I'm acutely aware that I'm afforded more privilege than my father, but much less privilege than someone who is considered white.
The vast majority of white Americans have really never been in a position where we've had to think actively about race and racism. In fact, we sort of have the privilege historically and still today of being really oblivious to the lived experiences of people of color. So then when those experiences get brought to our attention, either because people of color talk about them or some racial incident takes place or some study comes out demonstrating discrimination, we're usually caught very much off guard. We're sort of in that la-la land of believing that we're sort of in this post-racial place. And unfortunately, it's been that way for a long time. It's not just a modern phenomenon. White folks going back 40, 50 years did not, even in the early 60s, think that racism was really a big deal worth focusing very much attention on. A very small minority realized that it was. But the vast majority of whites said at that time that people of color had equal opportunity with white folks. So I think it's difficult because to be white is to be in that sort of bubble of obliviousness where you don't have to think about it. And if you don't have to think about it, you don't get a lot of practice talking about it. And if you don't have a lot of practice talking about it, when you finally have to, you usually don't have the language, you don't have the skills. It's like having a book club where people of color and white folks have all been asked to read the same book. And in this case, it's the book of their collective life. People of color have read 400 pages, white folks have read the preface, and then we're supposed to come together and have a conversation. It's not easy.
That's one of the reasons that we have difficulty having a conversation. We do not have a shared language, so we keep making things up. We keep making words to identify an experience we can't quite capture. What is this thing we call race, and why do we hold it so dear that it kills people? I don't see color as one of the most dangerous things we can say and one of the most dangerous ways we can live. If you literally can see, then you can see color. That is a ridiculous notion and one that tries to pass off someone as, I don't know what, equitable? No. People who are equitable see people as human beings, equitably. And people who practice equity as a verb are constantly doing what they say in Alcoholics Anonymous is step 4, a searching and fearless moral inventory. Every single day with every interaction, wondering, why did I respond that way? How did I feel in that interaction? How did I show up? Did I give them what they should have gotten from me? Whether it's a hello or some kind of a service or something we contracted to do in a job, did I give them what they deserved, even in spite of my own bias and filters? Of course we see color. And it's very dangerous to suggest that we don't. The myth of race and the reality of racism, a mentor of mine, the chair emeritus of American history at Macalester College named Mahmoud El-Khati, taught and has a pamphlet out titled The Myth of Race and the Reality of Racism. It is that which killed George Floyd, Philando Castile, Jamar Clark, and sadly, so many others. It is the idea that we invented the myth of race so as to race a group of people, so as to say whether or not they're human, so as to say whether or not they have value. And it results, this myth, in the reality that racism, which is a verb, it requires prejudice plus power. That's why you can't have reverse racism. The people who are being raced don't have the institutional power or social power that it takes to make white people have to live in disparities the way Black and brown and indigenous people are forced to live in disparity because of the invention of race. A system of advantage based on race. A system of oppression, 8 minutes and 46 seconds for George Floyd, 400 plus years for every Black person on this earth. A system based in the idea of superiority of white people and inferiority of everyone else. You must have the power to carry out and impact people's lives. In Minnesota, well before George Floyd was killed, we had the worst disparities in the country for education between Black and white students. And when someone decided to put an advertisement on the trains downtown, that became the focus of the problem instead of the problem. Why would we want to have a whole part of our state not be properly educated? Power. If you can't read, you can't vote. If you can't vote, you can't put your stake in it. Very quite literally. And for Black people, the ability to read was also restricted, if people recall. So the pictorial representation, if you still don't understand how racism works, Goldilocks broke into their house and they're going to jail. That's, for example, Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper in New York City in the park bird watching, or the little girl selling water so she could take the trip to Florida with her school pre-COVID, or the family who was barbecuing outside, or the mother who was in the pool at her hotel legitimately with her children on a business trip and had to meet the police because another patron didn't believe she was a part of the hotel, or the Harvard student who was napping in her dormitory before COVID in the main shared section and was also aggrieved by the police because somebody thought she didn't have the right to be there. Racism is a verb. Anti-Blackness is a specialty. It's a special kind of racism that is reserved for Black people. And it doesn't matter necessarily if you're light-skinned Black, if you're dark-skinned Black, or someone in between. Marvin Gaye, through Usher, is asking, what's going on? And we have to ask ourselves, what actually is going on? The Council for Democratizing Education defines anti-Blackness as two parts. It voids Blackness of value. Do Black lives matter? All lives matter. Blue lives matter. But not gaining the concept that if any one of those lives don't matter, then of course all lives don't matter. So if George Floyd's life doesn't matter, if his life is devoid of value, while systemically marginalizing Black people and their issues. How many times have you been in conversations with people who don't look like you, who said, this is my lived experience, and someone else immediately goes to minimize it? My ancestors didn't enslave anyone. Well, that's not my experience with the police. Well, I don't know, this is not me. Well, it might not be your experience, but that doesn't negate that other people have different experiences. And then beneath this kind of anti-Black racism is the covert kind, where they don't call you out of your name, where they don't tell you that you can't bird watch or you can't barbecue or you can't ride your bike or you can't go to the swimming pool. Not that kind. The covert structural kind, like racial covenants on housing, something we should all be very concerned about, mapping prejudice. How about segregated schools? We have those too. See, the kind of covert things that make us think we're liberal Minnesotans while other people suffer just underneath, and because of race, we can blame it on them. And then for the very few Black institutions we have, we disregard them. This is why they waffle and wobble, while organizations that are supported by people who are not Black can be strong. The Guthrie Theater versus the Penumbra Theater. What is the value? To imply that Black people are lying in a widespread way about racial injustice is itself a kind of racism, because it assumes that we cannot be trusted to be accurate translators of our own experience. If you relate your life to me and I discount it because it is not my experience, how do you feel? If I only make laws and policies and practice out of my own limited experience, what does that do to everyone else around me? Words inform beliefs and behaviors. What your mother said about the value of men in the workplace, what your father felt about women who worked outside the home, what your aunt said about the value of immigration culture is transferred unconsciously. Who are we talking about? When you have conversations in your own private circles or in your own secret heart, or when you're writing the grants, or when you're responding to the grants, or when you're in your workplace, when they say they're underrepresented, who are we talking about? Minimized, misunderstood, discounted, pushed aside, marginalized, invisible, hypervisible. Sadly, we could be talking about a whole bunch of communities. If you're not cisgender male and white, practically speaking, you can probably jump into one of these categories because that's how it's been set up historically. But the degree to which each of us is underrepresented, minimized, misunderstood, et cetera, is very significant. And think about these each being a pandemic in and of themselves before COVID-19 ever hit, invisible for anything good and hypervisible for anything punishment or penalty, or if we will go to work, or if we will entertain. Those are also okay for Black people, but not much else. And how does that help the world if dreams are deferred, in the words of Langston Hughes? And what happens to a dream deferred? To all the people who wanted to be something wonderful in the world who were unable. Planet Money recently released a podcast titled Patent Racism. And the researcher they were interviewing did research for, I think it was a 50-year span. I'll have to go back and check my facts, but I believe it was a 50-year span, when Black people were forbidden to get patents in this country, or forbidden to keep them in a multitude of ways. And that they'd done an economic analysis, this young researcher, and figured out that we'd lost in the Black community the wealth of the Netherlands in that 50-year period, just for racism in the patent process. For example, most people don't know the name Frederick McKinley Jones. He wasn't born in Minnesota, but came here at a very young age and lived in Halleck when his Irish father and his African-American mother abandoned him. He actually invented the snowmobile and the precursor to today's ATM. He's the reason that Thermo King is Thermo King, because he invented the refrigeration that allows us to send food all over the world, that allows us to get roses from anywhere we wish on Valentine's Day, if that's your day. But Thermo King has all his patents. They even have a museum about him. But nary a person knows his name. Because Dr. Carter G. Woodson understood about the inspiration that comes from the learning of your biography in history. So we don't write down good things about Black people because it doesn't fit the narrative. And when Black people write down good things about Black people, we suggest that they're racist.
I had certainly seen him before that particular afternoon, but he'd been just another cop. After that afternoon, he had red hair and blue eyes. He was somewhere in his 30s. He walked the way John Wayne walks, striding out to clean up the universe. And he believed all that. Like his heroes, he was kind of pin-headed, heavy-gutted, big-assed, and his eyes were as blank as George Washington's eyes. But I was beginning to learn something about the blankness of those eyes. What I was learning was beginning to frighten me to death. If you look steadily into that unblinking blue, into that pinpoint at the center of the eye, you discover a bottomless cruelty, a viciousness cold and icy. In that eye, if you do not exist, you are lucky.
Maya is reading from James Baldwin. This is the site where George Floyd was killed. Close to the time that he was killed, very early in the memorial. People leaving flowers around We Can't Breathe. The countless names on that street that don't even include all the names of Black people this year who have been killed at the hands of the police. At one time, you believed that the police are there to protect you. And then you look at the evidence when you used to see them all as police. And one day you pray you do not know them individually because you do not know whether you will go home. And it isn't whether you're a good person or a bad person or whether or not you've committed a crime. It is that your skin is the crime. Ashley Oliver, the poet, wrote a poem she titled Blank. She came and read it on air and she said, I start writing out the poem. Blank was the blank of blank. They went to blank blank and they loved blank. And their parents are blank and blank. And they have blank and blank sister. She said she had to write blank because she couldn't keep up with the names. The consequence for the myth of race turns into the verb, the reality of racism. And when these are our thoughts, and we are on planning commissions and councils and city boards and making rules for other people, conscious or unconscious, these are consequences, intended or unintended. All to hold on to a myth that must be very powerful because it has endured more than 4 centuries. Peggy McIntosh came to the St. Paul Foundation. She presented a piece from Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. It is excellent work. Everybody should check out. And when she came, she talked about what she called the 5 myths that support white privilege. These are 5 myths which I have been victim to my whole life, that I have to do a searching and fearless moral inventory about every day to decide whether it is from these myths plus one that I am making my decisions or deciding who's going to get help or not, or who's going to get the best of me or not. She says, the myth of meritocracy. Every individual is responsible for his or her own destiny, not influenced by society or circumstance. So Black people do poorly, and mainly many of them are concentrated on the north side of Minneapolis and the east side of St. Paul and in other areas because that's just how it rolls. They don't really have good jobs and they don't really take care of stuff, so they don't own much. But that doesn't account for racial covenants or redlining or economic segregation, or the list is too long for this class. Peggy says, this allows the denial of any systems of oppression or privilege. You got what you got because you got it or didn't. Myth 1. Myth 2 came up in the State of the Union this year in 2020. If you don't believe me, just replay it. The myth of manifest destiny. God gave white people the land that is the United States. I don't know, because there were other people here before that. So the evidence doesn't say that that's accurate. Peggy says this allows the denial that we live on land taken from indigenous people whose culture and existence white people sought to destroy. Racism is a verb. Active destruction for the purpose of power, land ownership, and the wealth is now in the land. Craig Wilder, author of Ebony and Ivy, when I interviewed him a few years ago, talked about when Europeans came across to what became the United States, they were very educated. But before they considered their own safety, what was the genesis of cities, before they considered that they had a sustainable food supply, they built colleges and universities to begin to write down the doctrine against the indigenous people who were here, to change the hearts and minds of people who would come, to marginalize indigenous people in order to get the land. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Islands, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. If you grew up around the time that I grew up, we pledged allegiance to a flag which James Baldwin said never even considered me. And we sang a song that indoctrinated me to the idea that somehow this was actually my land. Not that I ever really necessarily felt that way. But Baldwin said, in education, if you're white, is indoctrination. And if you're Black, subjugation. This land is not my land, but if I think it is, I might take better care of it, you dig? The myth of manifest destiny. Myth 3, monoculture. Peggy says there's only one American culture, and when people of color don't assimilate, they aren't behaving properly. I would look at the state of the world today and ask myself if that's the standard we really want to choose. White racelessness. White people are normal and set the standard for what it means to be human. Maya said she's terrified when she looks into his eyes at the deep cruelty that is the truth about our history and our present. Dr. King said if we aren't maladjusted to these conditions, something is terribly wrong with our soul. White moral elevation. This is always very difficult for me when I see the pictures of men and women and children being killed at the hands of mobs, standing outside of churches with their children. White people are in charge of the world and entrusted with power. That's not working out very well. Peggy says this justifies a sense of internalized superiority when encountering those of other races. How they have the nerve to show up in this spot where we go as white people is unspoken, but you know if you show up in a spot where they don't want you, nobody has to speak, but you absolutely are clear that you are violating the protocol. The rules that no one tells you or shares with you because you're not white, because you aren't in those secret talks, because you're not in those secret circles, because you are victim to the myths. And then, in 1899, Rudyard Kipling writes a poem. This is how big and dangerous words meaning things can actually be. He invented the idea that in order to civilize the Filipino people in 1899, the US should practice imperialism and go over there and take their land and socialize the Filipinos. And he birthed the white man's burden. The white man is so wonderful and perfect and in charge that everybody else needs the white person in order to do well. And the picture you see is the picture of what I call the white gaze. It is the way we have all been socialized to think about white in the United States and white in the world, even unconsciously, even to this day, even to this minute. And so each time I'm making decisions, I have to ask myself, am I doing so under the gaze of the myths of white? Or am I doing it because that's actually how I'm convicted and how I know better? Searching and fearless moral inventory is exhausting. Is this about me or is this about race? American means you're white. Everybody else has to hyphenate. African American, Native American, Asian American. That's the author Toni Morrison. She was told, Pulitzer Prize winner that she is, that she would never have won a Pulitzer Prize because she didn't center her books on white life. And frankly, many white people don't know how to have life not centered on white people. If white people aren't happy in the suburbs, they move downtown, so goes the pedestrian and bike lanes. White people are not happy downtown, they move back to the suburbs, everybody else move around until they're done moving around. In the book, I Have Spoken, largely a compilation of speeches from indigenous chiefs to the United States military. They write, when we were in our homeland, you came and you took it. And you asked us to move over here. Really, you made us move over here. And you said you wouldn't be coming back here. Now you're over here where we are again. And you're bringing alcohol and smallpox blankets to our people, and we're asking you to stop. But why are you over here? Because you told us we wouldn't have to move again. Why do we have to move again? We've asked you not to bring this alcohol here. We're asking you to stop. What is created in behavior can be stereotyped as culture.
Well, I know this. Anyone who's ever tried to live knows this. So what you say about somebody else, you know, anybody else. Reveals you. What I think of you as being is dictated by my own necessity, my own psychology, my own fears and desires. I'm not describing you when I talk about you. I'm describing me. Now here in this country we've got something called a nigger. It doesn't in such terms, I beg you to remark, exist in any other country in the world. We have invented the nigger. I didn't invent him. White people invented him. I've always known, I had to know by the time I was 17 years old. What you were describing was not me. What you were afraid of was not me. It had to be something else. You had invented it. So it had to be something you were afraid of. You invested me with. And that's so. No matter what you've done to me, I can say to you this, and I mean it. I know you can't do any more, and I've got nothing to lose. And I know, and I've always known, and really always, that's part of the agony. I've always known that I'm not a nigger. But if I am not the nigger, and if it's true that your invention reveals you, then who is the nigger?
Words mean things. We invent monsters because we have fear, largely because whether we individually or collectively have been part of harming others, are concerned that they will do the same. This has never happened. But it is a fear that underlies even our interactions today. Will people whom we have pressed press back? Will the people whom we have done, to whom we have done terrible things, will they do terrible things to us? I would argue for the most part, if you are a human being, you neither want to do bad things to people, nor do you want to have them done to you. This is irrational. So is this, but this is true. Old women who could barely walk or continued to force to have to pick cotton for the purpose of power and wealth, not their power, not their wealth, for the wealth of this country. And those bodies and faces inside of George Floyd's image are not the only ones. They're just the ones who are most recently known. Black people have been enduring that every day for 400 plus years. Think if you had a member of your family die every day, every single day. 400 years of institutional racism. Formal enslavement ended in what they said was 1865 with emancipation when the Black Codes began. Sundown towns, don't be anywhere after sundown. Don't gather in a group. Black people and white people can't swear in the same Bible. The Ku Klux Klan, the years hasn't ended. 1865 continues. Jim Crow, legal segregation by practice and design. When Jill started out, she said the work of the anti-racism work group is to look internally at our cultures and culture and practices. Jim Crow practiced legal segregation. Redlining. People believe they live where they want to live because they live there, or they live where they live because they wanted to. Well, I would argue if you met with mapping prejudice, as I did last week, you would learn that racial covenants kept many white neighborhoods white and still do today. War on drugs has not stopped. Even the institutions of policing on the radio today and the federal government admit that it hasn't been successful. Even doctors are suggesting now that it has been a disaster. But it was a tool in order to create the next phase, which was mass incarceration, which also hasn't stopped. What happens to a group of people who are, for the purpose of profit, stolen by kidnap, whose debilitation of the family structure being the primary means of social control? I will sell your children. What happens to a group of people whose children are now the focus of mass incarceration when the former Speaker of the House, John Boehner, owns a weed dispensary? The hypocrisy of race. The 3 strikes law, also on the books, 1993, and continues, even if the 3rd strike is a loaf of bread in a pandemic. So when we think about Black lives, let's think about the pandemics that have been happening for 400 years unrelentingly. The pandemics that we're still in, if you want to go ahead and believe this map, it is KKK, war on drugs, mass incarceration, 3 strikes law, COVID-19. Death at the hands of police, even if you're sleeping in your bed, even if you work as an EMT.
Three white men came to my cell, and one of them was a state highway patrolman because he was wearing a little silver plate across his pocket that said John L. Bassinger. And he asked me where I was from, and I told him I was from Roosevelt. And he said, I'm going to check that. And he went out, and I guess he called Roosevelt, and they didn't like me in Roosevelt because I worked with voter registration there. And when he came back, he said, you damn right. They said, you're from Roosevelt, all right. And we gonna make you wish you was dead. And they led me out of that cell into another cell. And he gave a Negro prisoner a blackjack. And he ordered me to lay down on a bunk bed. And the Negro prisoner said, do you want me to beat her with this, sir? And he said, you're damn right. Because if you don't, you know what I'll do for you. And I laid down on the bunk like he ordered me to do. And the first Negro beat me. He beat me until he was exhausted. And after he beat, the state highway patrolman ordered the second Negro to take the blackjack. And during the time he was beating, I began to work my feet because that was a horrible experience. And the state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro that had beat to sit on my feet while the second one beat. And I just began to scream where I couldn't control it. And then the white man got up and began to beat me in my head. I have a blood clot now in the artery to the left thigh and a permanent kidney injury on the right side from that beat. These are the things that we go through in the state of Mississippi, just trying to be treated like a human being. But still, this is called a part of America.
Her name is Fannie Lou Hamer. She's responsible for the co-founding of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. She's the reason Black people can vote Democrat. She was forced to sharecrop in Mississippi, and she was trying to register to vote. And this is the kind of violence that she received. Violence is taught and learned. It is not something we are generally born with. We must take responsibility for what we have done. And we must be honest to account for it, because no one can heal until everyone agrees that something really bad happened. And something really bad is happening as a result. And the tension of time is different depending on which angle you're coming from. As a Black woman, daughter, sister, mother, cousin, grandmother, wife, I don't understand why ending racism is a debate, except sadly at 52 I do. Black people have been calling out racism for generations in millions of ways. Taking a knee suddenly becomes a violent act. Not because taking a knee is violent, because we do it in church, many of us, but because the people who are doing it in protest because they're Black. Because ending racism shouldn't be a debate, because it's a soul wound on everybody. And it has been at the root of our planning in our district councils. This ideology, this theology, this propaganda sits in the hearts of all of us and comes out, whether we know it or not, in decisions we make. NIMBY, not in my backyard.
Our special coverage of Race for Justice continues with a new CBS News poll showing how Americans' view on racial discrimination are shifting. More than half of Americans believe that white people have a better chance of getting ahead in today's society. That's compared with black people. And now that's up 13 points from 2015. Nationwide protests against inequality are encouraging more people to have discussions, not only about race, but also white privilege. Robin DiAngelo is a sociologist, and she's author of this book, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. I love this title. She joins us with the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, CBS News contributor Ibram X. Kendi. Both of them join us this morning. Good to see you both. Robin, I'm going to start with you. In your book, you write this: unless white people have ongoing and intentional study, their opinions will be uninformed and ignorant. I read that and I thought, whoa, very blunt language. So I would like you to explain what white privilege is exactly and why white people have such a hard time seeing it, because it's so clear to most black people I know.
Certainly, and thank you for having me. White privilege is the automatic, taken for granted advantage bestowed upon white people as a result of living in a society based on the premise of white as the human ideal, and that from its founding established white advantage as a matter of law, and today as a matter of policy and practice. And it doesn't matter if you agree with it, if you want it, if you even are aware of it, it's 24/7, 365. And one of the reasons why it's so hard for white people to see it, well, there are many reasons, but one is it serves us not to see it. We come to feel entitled to that advantage. We're told that we deserve it and that we earned it. And we take great umbrage when that is challenged.
You write too, Robin, in the book that kids from the age between 3 and 4 are intuitively taught that being white is better, that you are superior. I thought that that was an interesting thing, but I find many white Americans today say, listen, I struggle too. I don't have white privilege. What are you talking about?
And I'm really clear that I'm not saying that white people don't struggle or face barriers or work hard, but there's a major barrier in this society, racism, that we don't struggle with, and not struggling against that barrier actually helps us navigate the barriers that we do struggle with. You grew up in poverty. How has being white shaped how you experience poverty and how you get out of poverty, if you do get out of poverty? Again, it's not saying that white Americans don't work hard, but it's a bit like being a fish in a current that impacts the outcome of that work. There's a kind of moving along that amplifies that work. And for people of color, for black people, you're swimming against a current. And we're both working, we're both swimming, but there's such a different impact on the outcome of that effort.
Ibram, what are the questions that you think white Americans should be asking these days? And I say this because I don't know any black friend of mine that hasn't gotten calls from white people all around saying, I don't know what to do, I want to help, I want to be supportive. A black male friend of mine in Texas said for the first time he was invited on the company retreat, and he's been there 10 years with his coworkers seeking him out. What are the questions white Americans should be asking?
Well, I think many white Americans claim they believe in racial equality. So the way you put that to the test is by asking questions about racial disparities. So why is it that unarmed black people are killed by police too many times and armed white people are simply arrested? Why is it in Minneapolis that black people are 20% of the population, but 60% of the victims of police shootings? Why is it that the black unemployment rate is twice as high as the white unemployment rate? And there's only two answers. Either there's something wrong with black people, there's something superior about white people, or racism.
Ibram, you've said that to end white privilege, you have to deal with racism first, right?
Yes, I mean, as Robin talked about, it is critical for white people, for people in general, to stop denying their racist ideas, to stop denying the ways in which policies have benefited them, to stop denying their racism, and to realize that actually the heartbeat of racism itself is denial, and the sound of that heartbeat is, I'm not racist.
Robin, do you believe that white folks actually care about racial injustice?
It doesn't appear that we do. If you look at what it takes to wake us up, when you look at the explosion of umbrage white people take from the simple claim that Black Lives Matter, from somebody respectfully going down on their knee, all of the outrage about that, and then it takes us literally seeing a man being murdered in front of our eyes to wake us up. You know, that's a really high price to pay for our enlightenment. And it just, you know, I wonder what will happen when all the cameras go away and there's another issue in front of us. You know, if we don't put something in place to keep our attention and our focus here. I mean, the status quo of our society is racism, and it's comfortable for white people. And so we're not going to get there from a place of white comfort. We're going to have to get mighty uncomfortable and inconvenienced. And it appears to me that in 20 years of working with white people, that if it requires anything of us like discomfort or inconvenience, we don't seem to be particularly motivated to do anything.
One of the lies of supremacy and inferiority is that it only hurts the people who are on the bottom. The lie hurts everybody. There has to be a great deal of collective pain in all of our DNA for the violent history we have and the violent present we're experiencing. White supremacy is a set of ideas that, when combined with power, make for racism. They impact people's lives to the point of death. We need to own the reasons we want to hold these myths so close. In this country, you see people loving Black culture, listening to Black music. You go, girl, taking all kinds of phrases and in idioms and things from the Black community, parsing out what white people think is acceptable from Black people, putting a white stamp on it and making it acceptable. No. If you love Black culture, you need to love Black people. You don't have the culture without the people. When I interviewed Isabel Wilkerson, the author of The Warmth of Other Suns, she said the problem with the North was that they wanted the labor but not the people. Well, it's an impossibility to have culture without people. What Black people desire is what you see with those little girls, just to live our life, to be able to drink a water, to bird watch, to ride our bikes, to not be afraid every single interaction that somebody's going to be concerned that our breathing is somehow in their space and call the police. And that people might realize that it is not the work of Black and brown people to have to do the undoing of racism, which we did not create. It does not benefit us, but we are absolutely brought up as racists. And the emotional labor that comes from living like that, the invoice could be much longer, but it just couldn't fit on the slide. Ibram X. Kendi, who just was teaching about anti-racism, if you wish to do something different than what you have always done, or you wish to continue doing something different than the world has always done, then make anti-racism a verb. In your private conversations, in your secret hearts, when nobody's looking and the joke comes up and it's not quite right, or someone says, this has been such and such in my experience with so-and-so, and you can say, well, that's not actually been my experience. Anti-racism requires courage and new words if we want new worlds. Otherwise, we will be stuck like Mr. Floyd until we die, which makes no sense for living human beings.
Everything now, we must assume, is in our hands. We have no right to assume otherwise. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious Blacks, if we do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and change the history of the world. If we do not dare everything. The fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible in songs by former slaves, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water, fire next time.
We have a choice whether we wish to stay this way. That's the greatest news I have of the day, that things do not have to stay this way. We do not have to believe all the things that we've been told, and we can learn new things so we can behave in new ways. And now I invite you to come on video and join me in conversation about your thoughts. And you will be welcomed and affirmed even if they are not in congruence with my thoughts. That's how dialogue and debate goes. Thank you for listening today.
Thank you so much for that, Lissa. Wow. There's so much information packed in here. We have definitely got to get this recording out to as far and wide as we can, share with as many people as possible.
Thank you, Jill.
We do want to open it up for questions or thoughts. So if somebody wants to unmute and just chime in, you are welcome to do that.
Hi, Lissa. This is Janet Pope. I joined late. Had a problem with the link. Sorry. But thank you for that and for making me uncomfortable through part of that, because hearing the actual recordings of people is very powerful. And I think you referenced, I know, well, we're in a district council format. So I'm going to go right there. And I know you've been involved formally with several other district councils. And I think there was a reference to district councils and how we perpetuate, well, we're part of the racist system, so white supremacist system. We perpetuate it. It's a very white group generally, as far as I know, the district councils, from having contacted many of them about the climate change issue in St. Paul 350. I don't know exactly what my question is, but if you could talk about your experience with district councils and with that system, I would appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's good to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for following up with Joe and for being here today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. You're the reason for the season. I would say my experience with district councils is frankly my experience with all of our structures, that we build them for the purpose of containing power and retaining power for white people and making sure that that power is not taken or affected by people who are not white. And so when I hear things like people will call and they'll say, well, you know, there's that new basketball court up there, but it's so dark. I think to myself, I go up there, I say, I don't know what you mean. And I realize, oh, the kids on the court. Oh, I was just in the city helping a human rights commission do some work. And one person remarked, you know, how can we have all these baseball fields and no, whatever happened to the basketball courts? I grew up here. You know, it's small things like that. Like, you know, it would be okay if they put it in Highland, but not okay if they put it on the east side or vice versa. Not in my backyard, next door, the apps, those neighborhood apps. They're some of the most painful apps I have ever read in my life. I have deleted every one. I will never read them again. They are soul wounding. So those would be some examples. And it's not individual people that I'm concerned with, because people can change their hearts and minds. It's the idea that people who get together around bad ideas can create bad policies and bad practices, which are bad ultimately for everybody. I hope I got somewhere in the ballpark.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's thinking, and I think Jill has challenged us to do a to do some scorecards. I liked your emotional scorecard there. And Jill, I agree with you. I think we need to get recording, and I know that Lissa, you know, Michael, as much as possible, talking about how to think about this as the district councils across the city, do their work. And I agree about Nextdoor. Oh my gosh. I'm not on it, but some people tell me about it and show me things, and I'm like, ah, yeah, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. A thinly veiled racism and white supremacy in the Como neighborhood, I will have to say. Really some awful stuff on the Como Nextdoor. I guess it may go to Roseville, but really some offensive.
The Nextdoor is interesting because I find that there can be some racist stuff like what's suspicious, okay? So suspicious cars driving down the neighborhood. And I will admit my daughter had been in one of those suspicious cars, okay? So, you know, it just boggles my mind sometimes of why people consider something suspicious. But I also see Nextdoor as an opportunity to, I mean, there's been a lot of talk, how you find out about some racism, like a lot of people have been complaining about how their BLM signs have been tampered with or stolen, or various things like that that I would not have known was going on if it weren't for Nextdoor. So it's you know, sometimes good, sometimes bad.
I really appreciate your feedback and I respect it. Having lived 52 years as a Black woman, I have this much tolerance for isms, my own isms and for other people's isms. So a small little bit of racism doesn't fly for me. If there's any racism on it that I feel is involved, I am not a part of it. That is a part of being anti-racist. So being anti-racist isn't just not being racist. It's going in and saying to people, this is a racist, thinly veiled statement. This is not okay, and this is not an environment I'm okay being in. And if it continues, then I'm not going to use the app, because it's people swallowing degrees of isms. Like, it's okay if it's just about those guys, but what happens when it's about you? What if the ism is you and no one stands up and says that's wrong? Then what happens? And so I don't tolerate degrees of racism. And so I don't tolerate Nextdoor, and I don't find value in anything that perpetuates racism, no matter what else it might be doing. That's my personal opinion, and is not negating at all the good experience you're having for the most part on Nextdoor. But as a Black person, I don't dig it at all. And I can tell you, walking into meetings with other brown people, not just Black people, the first thing when it was a recent board meeting right before COVID, and somebody's phone rang and somebody goes, oh Lord, they're on Nextdoor. And everybody brown looked at each other like, oh, everybody knows who they are then in the room. So just saying, lots of different experiences, but the same thing.
Okay, but on that note though, since racism is prevalent so much, where do you find, if you negate something because of a little bit of racism, then what's left?
Sadly, not much. Other spaces that don't involve a lot of white people, to be honest. I think one of the things that we don't often get to talk about is that when we think about safety, we often think about safety for white people from other people. We don't talk about that though, but that's what we're thinking about. But what we know from the George Floyd incident is the closer we are in proximity to white people, the more dangerous it is for us. Because if we're bird watching and a white person thinks that's not a good practice, we might have to interact with the police. If we are walking down the street and our daughter's selling water and someone doesn't agree with it and who's white and they call the police, they can the immediate assumption is not going to be that I'm in the right for the most part. So there is a power differential there that is very serious that we have not been able to impact. So a little bit of racism is as big as all racism. Tolerating a little bit is tolerating all of it.
And Lissa, you mentioned Black and brown people. Can you talk about, you know, when people say, you know, people of color and all people of color have been affected similar to Black people, and what differences are between the the white supremacist system and how it's experienced with as indigenous people and Black people and brown people. I know that's a big topic, but if you could speak to that a bit.
Sure. Thank you. When you have a dandelion in your yard, if you don't yank it out by the root, more dandelions grow. And that is what it is like, this idea of racism. Oppression and pain look different and the same. One, Black, brown, and indigenous people are all human beings. So we experience pain in a similar way to people who experience pain who are white. But because of the belief around race, we are dehumanized and subhumanized so that dogs can be sicked on people, water hoses can be used, all kinds of horrible tactics we would not otherwise exact on one another. And then what we do is we separate brown, indigenous, and people of color by lumping them all together and saying that they have comparatively bad experiences. So let's compare pain. What I say is pain is pain. The system is the same. It is designed to hurt you so that you do not hurt it. That is what it is. And if we get into the Trail of Tears or the internment of the Japanese or the Chinese Exclusion Act or the enslavement of African Americans or the building of the railroads, it all is horrible, what James Baldwin calls a bloody catalog of disaster. And to me, focusing on the detail of the bloody catalog will be appropriate when we are willing to talk about the catalog being a catalog at all. But first we have to be honest about the deed. And the deed continues.
Hey, Lissa, Michael here. How are you doing? Some of what you talked about, so the idea that white is the standard, the idea of being part of a white supremacist culture is that we are in this bubble of obliviousness. Is there a source of information where we as white people can get an inventory of what it is that we benefit from that we are completely oblivious to?
You always ask good questions. I'm gonna have to think about that one. You know, I would actually right now.
No, please go ahead.
I would say start with Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Because if you start learning about ways that race is just insidious in everything, you start to raise your awareness. And then you begin to do what I call the searching and fearless moral inventory, which is to really ask yourself, did I make this decision because this is how I came up and this is what my grandmother felt about the value of immigration? Or did I make this decision because this is my lived experience and I'm in my rational mind and heart making a decision based on that? So I think that starting there is a good place because there are a lot of white people talking about it, and not trying to be disrespectful, but white people work in fads. And so as long as this fad is going, jump on the bandwagon and keep it going because it's good conversation no matter what until it peters out, in the words of Robert DiAngelo.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Lissa. This is Em. Hi. So I felt like this was wonderful, and I think something that I think comes up a lot is first the understanding of racism as systems, like systems and institutions in place that make it work without necessarily, without honestly people having to do anything. They're in place, right? But and so then a calling out of racism with individuals can lead to, I think, individuals feeling like if they say they're not racist, or like, and let me think a better way to phrase this, like the understanding of racism as a system and not just individuals being bad. And so that if I say that you're doing something racist, it doesn't mean, it becomes, I feel like, defensive often because there's a like a jump from hearing I'm racist to I'm a bad person and I need to now defend my honor, like my entire lived experience or anything I've read, or, you know, like kind of listing merits or things like that with. And so it feels like there needs to be maybe a deeper understanding of anti-racism, of being anti-structural systems of oppression that have now leaked into kind of how I move through the world, but that if I hear that, to sit with, that's uncomfortable. I know they're not, maybe not saying I'm bad, but I need to see what system I'm upholding by defending that. And that's not really a question, but it's something that comes up often, and it feels like is why it can be so uncomfortable to call out racism and people don't do it, is because of that interaction that can happen back and forth, and it feels like it derails the maybe original point.
As always, Em, thank you. You're very insightful. We have a world that made up gender identity. We said we had women and men, and then we left it there. That's all she wrote. Nowadays, if somebody says they're not a man or a woman, people are, well, how am I supposed to address? What am I supposed to do? What do you write on the envelope? Well, for heaven's sake, you write what they ask you to write. I mean, what do you mean? But this is how society has to create norms. We need to have a man and a woman. Why? I don't know, but we need them. And so now we hold them dearly. And anybody who doesn't identify as that is somehow not on the proper spectrum. You dig? Race is the same way. It is a social construct we made up to understand something. This case for the purpose of privilege and power and penalty. And in doing so, we have to accept that we as individuals are a part of this system, whether we want to be or not. That's what Robin is saying. You can't make it that you were born white. I didn't make it that I was born black, but I actually wouldn't change my gig at all. I wouldn't, given the DNA and the history of other people, I'm copacetic with black people, really, I'm good. So all I'm saying is that when we accept any degree of ism, gender, family identity, religion, philosophy, any way of being in the world. You don't want to be a racist, a homophobe, a sexist, but we are. We are those things. That's how they exist in the world. So we immediately do become defensive, because when someone says, well, Lissa, you're very emphatic in your presentation, you're dang right, because I'm tired. I'm 52. How many times do I have to say this? So yeah, I might get defensive. Yeah, because I think it's about me. The difficulty is how to stay in the work anyway and own the truth. I am a white supremacist. How do I know this? I grew up as a white supremacist. So did you. So you can quit miss me with all the liberal Minnesota crap and everything else. This land is your land. This land is my land. Indoctrination. Black people are not doing well here, not because we're black and inferior, by policy and practice. How do I know this? Because I've never known a nigger, in the words of James Baldwin. I don't know anybody who needs one. I don't know any black people who know anyone. So who needs it? That's the kind of thing that I want people to do. Don't stop the work because you know you have to own your stuff. If your partner in life says you're not doing well and you're not getting along in your relationship, do you shut down and divorce the person? Or do you try to do better? And that's what I'm saying. Own it and do better. I'm trying to own mine and do better. Very good distinction, Em. Very good. I hear that. Oh, this is so good. I need to take you with me, please.
I'm just curious, for a district council that has a nearly entirely white board and a neighborhood that is predominantly white, what would decentering whiteness within our organization mean and look like to you?
That's a good question. I think education is always a way. I think your Sunday series is very good. And if you do it in the cutting edge ways where people are invited into conversations they don't typically have, which is why I tell people, you know, there may be people who can't stand this conversation. That's entirely up to you. I'm not taking any names. I mean, that's your work to do. But I think that one, education. I think number two, if you're considering policies and practices, if you do not have representative representation on your board, then you can do things like literally hire consultants who are people of that group that you're trying to listen to and see if they can help garner larger participation from residents in that area. get more information. In the age of Zoom, it's really, really easy to get subject matter experts, or I should say that it's much easier to get subject matter experts on Zoom to maybe teach a little bit about what's the intersection of land use and racial equity, for example. Lissa Davies out of Portland. Look at those areas that you're responsible for in that Road to the Community plan as a community council, and find out what's happening at the intersection of equity in transportation, equity in parks and green space, equity in housing. Because what we know now with the COVID pandemic is that danger comes to us in a different way. So what you used to think about in terms of people who are suffering homelessness, perhaps some people thought about it, it's always been very difficult for me, but at any rate, people might have thought, oh, that's a problem of the people who are experiencing homelessness. Now the people who are experiencing homelessness are A, showing what it happens when we don't have a home and we have to make one. And then B, in the age of COVID, what happens when we allow people not to be housed? How right is that and how wrong is that ethically? And now we're being forced to look at it as a country to say, how can we be the richest country in the world with this kind of homelessness? I'm driving around Northeast Minneapolis yesterday doing errands, and a little girl who was younger than my granddaughter ran out of one of the tents. And I was just, I had to pull over. I was undone. I was undone. What happens to a society that doesn't consider that a moral problem? It is when we tolerate a little bit of any of it, that it becomes all of it. And that's what I'm trying to get us to realize so we can stop. The last thing I will say, I've been asking 2 questions of communities. What color is the race card? Because I've never had one or seen one. And when I asked you where you got your primary information about race, I really do want you to go back there. Because if the primary information you're getting about race is not through personal relationships, you have a lot of work to do. 83% of people in 2018 who are white, according to the whitenessproject.org, reported that they only have white friends. That isn't only boring, but it's very dangerous. We need to have other friends so we can see in new ways. Or what James Baldwin prophesied through Maya, God sent Noah the rainbow sign. And that doesn't have to be religious. What they're saying is that heaven or whoever gave the earth a sign that trouble was coming. And now we are prepared for the flood, but he's sending fire next time. And it doesn't have to be religious. He can be, she can be, they can be the ethical part of the universe saying, climate change is real, so I will send fire and flood until you hear me. That's exactly what Baldwin's saying. If we do not endeavor, relatively conscious blacks and relatively conscious whites, to knock this thing down, then we will never knock down sexism and ableism and all the other billions of isms that we have created after we created race. So good luck, D10. And I'm proud of you. And I'm glad to have been in this conversation. And thank you for staying with it. And Scott Stanky, I see you.